Hello and welcome to Cloud Conversations, a fireside chat with Forrest Brazeal and Rubrik. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this fireside chat style conversation. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that are going to help you get the most out of this session. Let's talk questions. We want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. We won't be able to do a dedicated Q&A session at the end of this one, but we will pass along any questions that you have to the team from Rubrik for follow-up. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Okay, next, handouts. In the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to an ebook on protecting hybrid and multi-cloud data, a white paper on the Rubrik Security Cloud, and an opportunity to request a demo. So I encourage you to access those resources now or at any time throughout the presentation, and feel free to share them with your friends and colleagues. Now, I'm sure you noticed the prize icon there. At the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Okay, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get to today's timely discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Forrest Brazeal, he's a cloud architect, he's a writer, and he's a speaker. And then we have Joe Hladik, who's head of Rubrik Zero Labs, their research arm. So it's going to be a great conversation. I'm going to turn things over to Joe to get us started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Hladik. I'm the head of Zero Labs at Rubrik. Today, we have Forrest Brazeal, who is a educator and a cloud guru and all-around expert in the cloud space. And I'm excited to talk to him about the recent events around Codefinger and what the implications are there. I also want to dive into a little bit about his own content, his outreach to his community, get a little bit of understanding of his approach to education, and really just have a really fun general conversation around security and cloud and what those implications are. Forrest, welcome. I would love to hear a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Forrest. Kind of a longtime cloud and DevOps guy. I used to be an AWS community hero back in the day. I worked at Google Cloud for a while after that, which, those were separate phases of my life. You can't be both at the same time. And most recently, I co-founded a company called Freeman and Forrest, along with Emily Freeman, who's another amazing kind of longtime DevOps voice. And we do an influencer marketing thing for companies, but mainly what that means is I get to spend a lot of time just learning from folks across the tech space and just getting a feel for, what's being built, what's not being built, where the gaps are. And I'm just excited to have a conversation with you, Joe.
Great. Can you share insights from your transition from software engineering marketing at companies like Cloud Guru and Trek 10, just to founding, is it Good Tech Things?
Yes. Yeah,
what motivated this shift for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a personal brand that I have. I always encourage folks in tech to, build a deep skill stack of things you do well, right? I think particularly with the advance of AI, it's become clear that, just being able to write code or just being able to configure YAML or just being able to click around in a GUI, depending on, how you've defined yourself as an IT person, none of those are the skills that are going to sustain you for the next 20 years, just because we have, automation that can do a lot of those things now in a way that I couldn't even 5 years ago. But that doesn't diminish our value as human beings whatsoever. It just means that, we have to embrace being whole people. There was a long time where you could get away with just pigeonholing yourself into a very narrow technical skill set. And now we have to be able to think and write and communicate and negotiate and work with each other. We have to be able to think about the business needs of the company as well as just the very specific technical needs of the project that we're working on. And after, a whole career in kind of IT and software engineering, I moved more toward the go-to-market side of the business because I just felt the need to have a more holistic grasp of what it is we do. And that's been a great move for me. Not everybody has to take that exact path, but I do encourage you to know who you are beyond just the particular technical skill set that you have right now. I think that's going to become only more important as we move forward.
During your tenure as head of developer media at Google, what strategies did you implement there to engage the developer community?
Yeah, I was proud to help launch the Google Cloud Innovators Program and their Champion Innovators Program, which are, I think it's rolled into the larger Google developers community there now. But this was the kind of flagship program that we use to celebrate our community and our developers around the world. And that gave me the opportunity to learn from and work with folks who were building things with the cloud, ranging from folks inside large companies to kind of like hobbyist developers and academics, all the way out to folks who were, consulting and dealing with lots of different companies in their own right. And I think what I learned from that, beyond just what an amazing diversity of talent we have in this industry, is that once you look at yourself as someone who has a kind of public responsibility in your work, right? And I'm talking about these cloud champion innovators. When I think about that, these people that Google had selected as, especially exemplary folks in the developer community. Once you come to think of yourself as having that public responsibility, it means that your job, your day job, is only one piece of what you do professionally and who you are, right? Your need to respect the community and to look out for and protect those around you goes way beyond that. It transcends an individual job that you have. That was inspiring to me to learn that from those people. It's something I try to carry into the work that I do now.
Cool. I before we dive into any sort of specific current events, I wanted to get a little more information around your background with cloud security.
Oh yeah.
And really understand your perspective on, what are the most pressing challenges with cloud security? I know I have my own opinions, but just with your experience working with the developer community at Google and everything else.
Yeah, no, of course.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, to be clear, I'm not a cybersecurity career professional. I have great respect for those that do that. It's something that I've had as a portion of my role for a lot of my career, because at some point, particularly in the cloud, everybody has to be a little bit of an accidental security admin. The lines just become so blurry, right? You can't build a piece of software in the cloud without thinking about auth, without thinking about identity, and without thinking about how you're going to manage access for different services and groups. I actually won what's called a Pony Award at Black Hat a few years back for a song I wrote about ransomware, the conclusion of which was that we should probably just blame math for all the ransomware problems that we've had. You can still find that on the internet. And that kind of leads me to my perspective on security and the cloud world, which is, as much as we try to lead the bleeding edge of, we're going to go after all these advanced persistent threats and look at these, incredibly arcane, sophisticated things that hackers and nation states are trying to do to us. Like 90% of what's out there and 90% of the people that are getting dinged are just for what have been the same kind of basic bread and butter security problems, blind spots, holes that we've had since way before the cloud, right? I mean, it comes down to giving people too much access, right? Or giving people, access for too long, it's amazing how much of our problems today are still just, hey, somebody, shared their password with someone else, right?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to things like overexposure, data that it's not managed correctly, or
that's all it is.
Yeah,
these are not like
configurations is a big one I've always seen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. These are not the, the rootkits that are being beamed in from, nation states where you would just have no defense against it as an individual security admin. These are like just not having a good grasp of service control policies in AWS, right? Or, not thinking carefully about the hygiene of what you do with your secrets. And then they get committed publicly, and then you end up with something like Codefinger. These are, again, it's not like light bulb moments. These are not things that are going to win any headlines at security conferences. But if you can get good and you can get tight and clean at enforcing these things as a security team, so many of the more esoteric things are just never going to make it to you. And I don't know, it just sounds boring to keep talking about it, but the problem is not going away. And if anything, as new generations of folks come in, we have to get more disciplined about reiterating this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, Joe.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you brought up the boring aspect of it. I think that's a big part of the problem. Is that at least in my experience, a lot of people always want to do the interesting work, and that is such a subjective idea, because like, what is interesting? Everybody can think of something a little different to them.
Yeah.
But in my days doing incident response, I'd say 90% of the time the work is not interesting. It's a lot of grueling, hours long, just data analysis, and eventually you might find that little breadcrumb in a a huge pile that leads to something that is significant, and that might happen once a year, once over several years. And I really want to recognize the analysts and the investigators that really spend the time, and that have the patience to really find those little threads to pull. I mean, pulling those threads have led to the discovery of things like SolarWinds breaches and many others. But most of the time, like, the work is not, for the most part, like, really interesting. It's boring.
Right.
And getting through that is really, I think, the difficult aspect of it from a emotional, psychological aspect too, right? Because
I think you're
how fulfilling is that every day,
Yeah, it's not glamorous work, and I think sometimes it goes underappreciated even by, the teams that you're supporting, right? It's almost like it's not until you have a breach that all of a sudden the funding comes in and there's a lot of attention paid to this, which is exactly backwards, right? The proactive appreciation for and funding of security is something we have to get better at as an industry. It's funny. I run a community initiative on the side called the Cloud Resume Challenge, which is a program that helps folks from non-traditional backgrounds, career changers, people without a 4-year IT or computer science degree, helps them build new careers in technology. And a lot of the folks who are most successful in these programs, they get placed in cybersecurity roles and junior DevOps engineer roles and things like that. A lot of these folks come from backgrounds where they're like, they're plumbers, they work in construction, or they were one guy who was a miner, like an underground miner, or a logger, not the kind that logs things out to standard out, but the kind that logs things to the back of a truck, because he cuts down trees. I mean, like, you wouldn't want your plumber to tell you, "Oh, I only do interesting jobs." This is not an interesting job. Your plumber's not going to say that. Your plumber's like, "Hey, I'm here to, do the work, get you cleaned up, and get out." And that's the vibe that sometimes we need to have, the attitude we need to have as IT professionals. And folks sometimes get that a little more when they've come from, another trade. So it's cool to see them getting the opportunity to succeed in tech.
I'll second that too. I think there's something to it. A lot of the best talent and people I've even maintained relationships with over the years are former history teachers or English teachers, even, where they may not even have a technical background, but they have a passion. Either if it's just having an analytical mindset, and then all of a sudden you're directing that energy into finding things. And once you find that one thread and you pull it, the feeling of that fulfillment really sets in. And then it's almost like an addiction in that sense, where I want to find the next one and I want to keep doing this. And that's what's kept me in this industry for 20 years, is just, having those small wins leading to very large victories is so incredibly fulfilling.
I think that's absolutely right.
So I just want to pivot a little bit. before I dive into the current event, I want to dive a little more into the education aspect of this, because it kind of ties into what we were just talking about. Because when we're talking about people coming from various backgrounds that aren't necessarily trained and educated in computer science or forensics, and they end up being some of the best investigators out there. How do you think your work will uniquely sort of have that outreach through like music and cartoons? Because I find that fascinating. Like how much success have you found in these creative mediums to really outreach to people that may not necessarily find an interest initially in this type of work?
That's an interesting question. Success for me is, if one person, if it touches them, right, then that's successful. It's worth sharing yourself. But what I found is I've started, as you mentioned, I do music. I go and sing these silly songs about tech, and I do it in large rooms at conferences now where people are there. And what often happens is I like to say, if you can get people to laugh with you, then you can get them to cry with you, right? If you can get them to let down their guard enough to enjoy something, then they can let their guard down enough to absorb a serious message. And that's really the intent behind a lot of these things I do. You can find these silly cartoons that I draw at goodtechthings.com. Like I just drew one the other day about phishing tests, right? And these tests that seem like security teams put them together, maybe more to sort of enjoy hunting their own colleagues for sport more than they do actually building meaningful skills. And this mandatory security training people go through feels so punitive. I mean, people have lots of different opinions about that. I have an opinion about it, right? And you can't have a good conversation about that unless you can situate it in a ridiculous enough context that people feel disarmed. And then all of a sudden you're having an interesting conversation. And that's what I do with the cartoons. That's what I do with the music. And it seems to work. It seems to help. In tech in general, we tend to have, I think, I don't know, we're a little bit disconnected from our emotions. We like computers. We don't want to be pulled out of our shell. I speak of myself. This is how I tend to be. And there's something really magical about coming into a room with 300 or 400 or 500 folks like that. These are my colleagues. These are my people. These are the people that I've spent my career working with. And to come to a place of genuine emotional depth and meaning and understanding with them. And then to have conversations afterward. I'll have people come up to me afterward and just want to kind of just share something really deeply held about their career, their hopes and dreams and fears that I don't think felt like they had the space to share that. That's a beautiful thing. That's what makes the artistic piece of it worth it. And I'm going to keep doing that as long as, people still find value in it.
I think that makes a lot of sense too. Cause like even in just music in general, it touches your emotional strings and you map memories to certain songs, right? The song comes on and you think of something that happened in your life at some point in time. I think it's a very unique approach to, garnering interest in education, and that it might have the same effect long term, right? When you're sort of galvanizing people in a way that, touches them emotionally so that they are able to relate to these things. I think that's a very, very unique and special approach.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So I wanted to, now pivot a little bit to what's been in the news lately around Codefinger and how ransomware attacks. To me, like after reading into what Codefinger is and like the attack vector is not different. It's more or less a change in tactics, right? Using compromised credentials to access, say, an S3 bucket, and then instead of data theft, it leads to, they're changing their tactic to encrypting that data instead and locking organizations out of accessing it, right? What are your thoughts in terms of like, if we already knew about this, right? Like that this is a potential vector. I know this because, in conversations I've had with colleagues, we've talked about this as a potentiality, right? This is a vulnerability, but we never really saw any prevalence around it. What are your thoughts around like just the change in tactic?
Yeah.
Like why now? Why not last year?
Right. Well,
What are
I
you?
think we did see some of it last year. I would say the encryption ransomware thing has been coming on
Yeah,
probably for a few years now. But you're right, it is gaining more prevalence. Part of it is just, I mean, so if you don't know Codefinger, it's a specific attack that's just people harvest compromised AWS credentials, and then they get access to your S3 bucket, and they encrypt your data, and then they leave a ransom note basically in the bucket, and they ask you to pay them to decrypt it for you, because AWS doesn't have the ability with the HMAC stuff that's logged out to CloudTrail to do it for you without the decryption information that they hold. So it's like you can explain it in 10 seconds. It's not some brilliant, clever, convoluted attack. It's literally just brute force. They took your key, they encrypted your stuff, and now they want you to pay them. And I mean, to the extent that this is new, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is just, there's so much data in S3 now that it is a valuable attack source for people, right? We're 15 plus, almost 20 years now, honestly, into the cloud revolution, which means that the big enterprises are finally using it, right? I don't even know if 10 years ago you could have said that. I don't think 10 years ago you could have said, oh, S3 is going to be where I'm going to go to, put the hurt on big government and healthcare and everything, right? They were not in the cloud to the extent that they are today. Now you've got those targets, and you've got the companies that are willing to, potentially pay up. We have had some high profile cases in the past few years where large companies have paid off these hackers to get the ransom money, or to get their data decrypted, I should say. The other thing I think to keep in mind is ransomware has become organized crime in the last few years, right?
absolutely.
These are not sort of lone wolves in a basement somewhere. These are people
Ransomware as
with
a service is an actual bottle now. That's
yes,
they're
yes.
monetizing it.
Exactly. There are whole middleware layers you can buy. There are people sitting in cubicles who probably have HR. They're probably taking mandatory security trainings on their own because one of them failed a phishing test from their internal IT, right? It's just a business. And so, of course, it's not going to be these brilliant, clever hacks that exploit a novel 0-day kernel bug that nobody's ever heard of before. Sometimes it might be, but a lot of times it is just going to be, let's go find the folks who weren't disciplined enough to take care of their AWS keys, and let's go encrypt their S3 objects. That's it's just what's different about it is the scale of it. This is being done mechanistically, programmatically by folks who are project managers. There are stand-up meetings, I would guess, at some level in these organizations. That's what's a little new and different about it. And it just means that, you have to be more organized than they are. And theoretically, yeah, that's both the easiest and the hardest thing in the world to do, right? When the fix is human, that's hard.
It's funny you mentioned that. So I started as a red team operator before I got into the defensive side. And looking back on it, and even now, the offensive side is always easier because you have one thing to worry about, and that's the target. And it's just a matter of how you get there. On the defensive side, you have policies to maintain and abide by. You have SLAs, service level agreements that you may have to meet in timeframes in order to respond to different alerts. Yes. You have, not just that, the security engineering side, where how do I fill all these holes in my network or my environment in general? Defense is a very complicated thing, and it's not something that it's ever going to be perfect. Attackers are always going to be poking holes in new ways that we've never seen before.
Yeah.
So, in light of that, I know before I ask the next question in terms of what advice should we give to organizations facing these crises, you mentioned organizations as a result of ransomware attacks paying extortion demands, right? We're seeing now some, especially in Europe, changes in regulations and legislation that will make extortion payments illegal if that legislation passes. What type of, in your mind, what type of implications do you think that has? Because you're effectively taking away an option for people to recover, even though it's not, something I would advise right off the bat to pay an extortion demand, but you're taking that option away from organizations. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not the expert on, sort of governance in this area. My initial reaction is, anytime you add regulation like that, which takes away an option from sort of creative, desperate people, which is who you quickly find yourself to be when you're in a situation like this, there's going to be second order effects that you don't foresee. And, whether that involves, I can tell you, I don't think that it's going to encourage, ransomware vendors to be less aggressive in going after companies, right? If anything, I think you're going to find that there's they just change their targets and their tactics in order to try to get paid in other ways, or to just change to spend more of their time going after companies that are in areas that are somehow not covered by the regulation, right? Because there's always holes in this stuff. And then the other possibility is you'll have companies that just take out insurance so that whatever fines are there for the extortion payments, right, are less. It's all just dollars and cents at that point. It's terrible, right? That it just becomes like a fine is the cost of doing business, the cost of getting your data back online. Is it when the factories are down and you're losing X million dollars every hour that your data is encrypted and offline? At some point, the just pure cost benefit of, okay, do we pay the ransom? Do we pay the fine? It becomes much less of a non-starter.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so back to things like the Coatfinger incident. We've already established that this is not new. It's just something that's become more popular in recent media. What advice do you have to organizations to secure that? I know we've talked about there's misconfigurations, bad IT practices, and bad IT practices doesn't necessarily mean negligence. It could just be prioritization or budget and resourcing, right? There's so many reasons why these things happen the way that they do. What is your advice to organizations in terms of trying to prevent this type of?
There's all the generic advice, the things you just mentioned, Joe. I think the big missing piece for a lot of these large shops right now is just getting really, really tight on identity. It's a missing piece, I think, in a lot of security postures right now, to have a really, really strong story around, hey, we have all these different divisions of our company and they're all over the world and we've acquired people and we just don't have really good centralized governance on who has access to what, how long they have access to it for, how much access to it they should have, and how we enforce that they're not taking these secrets and putting them in places that we don't control, right? That's the easiest and hardest thing in the world. And there's all kinds of tools that are trying to solve this. I don't think there's an industry standard solution to solving your identity posture at scale across a huge, diverse multinational organization. And that's where these attackers are slipping in, because that's what gives them the credential they need to encrypt you. That's what gives them the credential they need to exfiltrate. You just have to get used to this cloud world where there is no air gap, there is no firewall. It's just identity is what stands between you and the attacker. And I think corporations are slowly waking up to this. They're awake to the idea that they have to fix this, but and then everybody's scrambling around trying to glue together different tools to make it work, and it's just going to take time. I think we will build that competency as an industry. From what I'm seeing, we're not quite there yet. What's your perspective on that, Joe?
I think it comes down to like I mentioned earlier. A lot of the problems I've seen is not necessarily negligence. It's getting the right leadership to make the decisions to prioritize just basic configuration protections. Because most often I've seen from my experience, the threat actor is always going to go the easiest route. They're never going to. It's not necessarily like Hollywood would depict it, where you have these, highly sophisticated attack scenarios. I mean, I've definitely have seen those, especially with SolarWinds. That's probably one of the most sophisticated attacks I've ever been involved in, and experienced. But that's like a once a decade type of thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Where tens of thousands of organizations are compromised all at once, and it's a massive supply chain compromise. That doesn't happen as often. But something like this, where it's very misconfigurations, the basic practices, is so commonplace. It's really, I think, a matter of just getting the right leadership to prioritize these, to make sure that the right controls are in place. And it's not a compliance issue. I think compliance only takes you so far. It's a practice thing. IT and security need to really talk more.
Yeah.
In a lot of organizations, IT and security are often split and siloed.
Yes.
And my advice to these organizations is communicate more. Come
Very
up with a way or a channel where leadership can communicate effectively with each other and prioritize different methodologies to make sure that these more simple scenarios or basic scenarios are actually addressed appropriately.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that goes right back to what I was saying about identity, because historically, Corp IT has handed out credentials to people, right? And security has managed the running stuff. See where the problem is?
Yeah.
That distinction doesn't exist anymore. You know, it's just got to be, these people have to be on the same page and incentivized the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great call out.
And the other thing too is, you know, it's like the copycat scenario. I have so often seen where once a specific tactic is known to be really effective at a large scale, then you have other threat actors sort of copycatting that exact thing because, you know, it's not just a trend, but it's also effective and it's been proven to be so. You think this particular coat finger situation is going to have a similar outcome in that? And I mean, in my perspective, again, the threat vector is basically the same as it always been. It's just a different tactic. But do you think the prevalence is actually going to increase and actually cause a lot more applications to organizations this way?
It's kind of like the beating will continue until morale improves. I feel like the threat will continue until posture improves. I feel like we've been seeing these S3 attacks for so many years now. And again, it was typically an exfiltration thing. Now they're encrypting stuff. I mean, if folks haven't learned by now to protect their credentials, then I suppose we will continue to see this. But again, like if this problem was going to be solved, think it would have been solved before now. I think we've got many more of these type of breaches to come. And again, it's no shade to AWS. There's nothing wrong with S3. If anything, they've gone overboard in recent years, adding more and more giant red flags and warnings and controls to S3 to help people not put themselves in this position. But you know, with suitable will, you can get yourself into a posture like this. And unfortunately, just like you said, attackers like to take the easy route. Sometimes, you know, internal admins like to take the easy route too, right?
Exactly.
And that's what gets you into this trouble.
Exactly. And that's often one of the reasons for identity compromise as well. Not having the right security protections around those, especially whether you want to call it a service account or a non-human identity. Yeah. You know, any identity that's applications are actively using to access different databases are always a huge vector, because if they're not protected and they're easy to exploit, well, what kind of access do those identities have? Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. And there's all kinds of tools that can help you sort of model this, you know, posture internally. But again, like, it's one thing to model it once it's already out there. It's another thing to have the practices and the standards internally to not create these messes in the first place, right? And that's really where it begins. It's always the same with, you know, data storage, right? It's always easier not to store the data, always easier not to create the account or to disallow this thing than to, you know, sort of sort it out afterwards. And that's the eternal tension with security, right? The most secure thing is the thing that doesn't run at all, but you do have to have a business. So you got to evaluate your risk levels there.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much into it, but that's always been sort of my criticism of the zero trust model. Because it's like there's always going to be some level of trust, because nothing will work without it.
Yes.
You know, and I understand the principles and the philosophy of zero trust. It makes a lot of sense, but to be completely a zero trust environment is a very difficult thing to become.
That's right.
So I know we're coming up on time here. I wanted just to pivot a little bit. And I think you and I have identified a similar interest that's a little off topic in terms of AI. I know I have my thoughts in terms of whether it's generative AI or AI agents. What are your thoughts, just, you know, if we could get a little wild here in terms of what the potential outcomes could be? What do you think like is going to happen in terms of the AI impacts in the next 5 years?
I mean, that's such a huge question. Let's try to scope it down to, you know, maybe the IT world or the world that we're talking about, right? Yeah. And we're more than 2 years into the current Gen AI boom. It's been that long since ChatGPT came out and really kickstarted this whole thing, put GPT-3 at the front of everybody's minds. And started this mad scramble that we're still seeing, this arms race for more and more GPUs and other types of AI accelerator chips, and smarter and smarter agents and models that score higher and higher on these benchmarks. And I think it's been well said that change in this area happens both more slowly and more quickly than you realize, meaning that we can look around and say, things don't feel that different than they did 2 years ago. Like, an AI agent has not taken my job. There's not one that I would trust to do it. I don't think any IT person would say differently. But at the same time, you take a half a step back and look at where we are, and you're seeing, this hiring manager says, I'm not going to hire a junior employee right now because, we feel like we don't need to train someone up. I've got, admins who are generating a lot of their own templating now, that's 80% correct using these AI assistants, and then they're getting the rest of the way there on their own. But that senior expertise is needed to cross that extra 20%. So why would I bring on a junior hire? I think that's a very short-sighted and self-defeating way to think about it, right? You got to get those seniors from somewhere. And we could have a whole conversation that's way off topic for this discussion about how you build strong apprenticeship programs and bring up that next generation of technical talent without assuming that they're going to be like a code monkey or a script monkey for you in their first few months on the job. Right. That used to be how we brought those people along. Now we have AI to do that. So what does it mean to be a junior in the age of AI? We could have a whole separate webinar where we just talk about that. Yeah. So I think that trend, unfortunately, is going to accelerate until such time as, there's a market crunch and people get upset about it. That's the way it's always been in IT.
I agree.
I think the agent conversation especially is interesting because working with an AI agent implies that the agent is able to do things that are, as effective as what your employees right now can do, or at least, to the extent that it frees up meaningful amounts of decision-making power for people. My prediction right now is that those agents will be much more effective in areas that are not IT operations. And the reason I say that is when you're making real-time decisions in IT, whether you're on the security side, whether you're on the backup and restore side or whatever, you can automate things, and we do automate things, but at some point, you're talking about decisions that involve SLAs, and anytime you do that, a human has to be in the loop, right?
Absolutely.
I think as far back as the 50s or 60s, didn't the military have a directive like, a computer must never make a management decision, something like that? Cool. I think it's the same in IT. A computer must never make a decision that affects SLAs. There will have to be a human involved. So I don't know. I mean, we'll see how advanced the agents can get within that framework. But we're nowhere close to being able to hold an agent materially responsible for that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Well, Forrest, it's been a fantastic conversation with you. I'd love to have another conversation eventually, even maybe one dedicated to AI, because there's a lot we could pick apart and really discuss there.
It's
but
fascinating.
I really appreciate your time.
Of course, Joe. This was lovely. I'll catch you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Forrest.
All right. Yeah. Well, just to echo what Joe and Forrest said there, that was just a great conversation. And for those of you who asked questions, we will make sure that the Rubrik team gets those so they can follow up with you. And a quick reminder that this is your last chance to grab those handouts, that ebook, the white paper, the opportunity to request a demo before we close this event here in a moment. And on to our final piece of business is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card is Matt Wolf from Illinois. So congratulations to Matt. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending. That's going to conclude today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.